From Buffalo, Toronto Public Media and WBFO, this is What's Next. With top shooter Payton Gendron scheduled back in court on Friday, February 2nd, today's show features producer Patrick Hosken having conversations with legal experts around the issue of capital punishment. First, Megan Byrne, a staff attorney at the ACLU's Capital Punishment Project, explains what to expect from the federal case against Gendron and discusses the implications of race in relation to the death penalty.
Any kind of nudge forward the acceptance of capital punishment as something that should exist or something that isn't racist or something that won't end up disproportionately killing so many more black people, I can't support anything on that road.
Then William Easton, a partner at the law firm Easton Thompson Kasperek Shiffrin and former supervising attorney at the Capital Defender Office, traces the history of the death penalty in New York State and his experience defending against it. All this and more on What's Next. First, the news.
For Buffalo Toronto Public Media, I'm Tom Birich with your local headline news. A Buffalo man has been sentenced to 23 years in prison for fatally shooting another man in a vehicle at a stoplight, Erie County District Attorney John J. Flynn announced. Erie County Court Judge James Barnese also ordered Mujahid Miller to undergo 5 years of supervision after he's released. Miller pleaded guilty November 16th to first-degree manslaughter, a Class B violent felony. Prosecutors said Miller fired an illegal handgun at John Rico Walker Jr. of Buffalo as he sat in a vehicle stopped at a red light at William and Hickory Streets near Town Gardens about 2:15 p.m. on October 16, 2022. Walker was taken by ambulance to Erie County Medical Center with a head wound and died there a few days later. Rico D. Small of Buffalo pleaded guilty yesterday in Erie County Court to a single count of enterprise corruption, acknowledging that he oversaw a retail theft ring between October 2022 through September 2023, according to the Erie County District Attorney's Office. Prosecutors said Small employed other people to steal items from retailers throughout Erie County and then sold the stolen merchandise. The ring is believed to be responsible for about $70,000 in thefts. Small, who is being held in lieu of $200,000 bail, faces a maximum of 25 years in prison when he is sentenced on March 6th. District Attorney John J. Flynn said in a statement yesterday that such thefts are financially devastating for retailers, especially local small business owners. He commended Detective Chris Lavallo of the Cheektowaga Police Department and various members of the State Police, Buffalo Police Department, Cheektowaga Police Department, and the Town of Hamburg Police Department for their work in the investigation, which is ongoing. 9 school districts in Western New York will receive state grants to help recover from the pandemic learning loss and expand mental health services for students, Governor Kathy Hochul announced. 2 of them, the Buffalo City School District and Erie 2 Chautauqua-Cattaraugus Board of Corporate Education Services, will get awards from both programs. Buffalo will receive $2,888,515 from the Pandemic Learning Loss Program and $5 million from the Mental Health Program. Erie 2 Board of Cooperative Education Services has been awarded $667,742 to combat learning loss and $364,202 for mental health services. Also receiving $308,298 in learning loss assistance is the Cuba Rushford Central School District in Allegheny County. Mental health funding will go to 6 other local school districts: Clarence, which will receive $921,702, Dunkirk, $290,572, Gowanda, $182,733, Iroquois, $200,000, City of Tonawanda, $1,250,106, and Williamsville, $55,983. The grants are part of $100 million in assistance awarded to 50 school districts across the state to help students who have fallen behind due to the pandemic and to support student mental health concerns. For WBFO, I'm Tom Birich.
I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
I'm Angelique Preston.
We need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We're going to have some real healing. We've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
equity, and the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
Welcome to What's Next. I'm Patrick Hosken. Ahead on today's episode, I'll be speaking with 2 attorneys, Megan Byrne of the ACLU's Capital Punishment Project and William Easton, formerly of the Capitol Defender Office in New York State, about what to expect in the federal death penalty case of Payton Gendron, who carried out a racist shooting attack at Tops Supermarket on May 14, 2022. Gendron is scheduled to appear back in court on Friday, February 2nd. This latest update in the case arrives at a time when capital punishment is once again making national headlines. On January 25th, Scott Tong of member station WBUR's program Here and Now spoke with the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, Robin Marr, about where we are in America with the death penalty.
Tonight, the state of Alabama is scheduled to execute inmate Kenneth Smith. The method is nitrogen gas used for the first time in a U.S. execution. The plan is to put a mask over his face and then fill it with nitrogen to deprive him of oxygen. Smith is filing a last-minute appeal to the Supreme Court. It has already declined to intervene once. Kenneth Smith is one of two people convicted in a 1988 murder for hire of a pastor's wife. Let's talk about this case and the death penalty in this country with Robin Marr. She's executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, which we should note takes no position on the death penalty itself. Robin, welcome.
Great to be here, Scott.
Now, the state of Alabama tried to execute Kenneth Smith a little more than a year ago by lethal injection, but they failed. They couldn't find a vein for the IV before the death warrant expired. Now they're trying nitrogen gas. Now, Smith spoke to NPR from prison last year, and here is what he said about what it's like to face this upcoming execution.
I've been doing time for 35 years now, and I've tried to place myself in my brother's shoes when they're around the corner and going through this, but nothing prepares you for it. The anxiety and stuff starts building before you ever get your date. You know, as you're approaching that time, and the anxiety starts to build.
Yeah, the audio is a little challenging, but boy, him talking about the mental trauma. Robin, help us understand the process scheduled for this evening, nitrogen hypoxia. How does it work?
Well, I think you've already identified sort of the broad outlines, and it should be noted right off the bat that we don't have all the information about this protocol. That's one of the challenges here, and one of the reasons there are so many concerns. Like many death penalty states, Alabama has chosen to shroud its procedures, even the identification of the execution team, in secrecy. But what we know is that Mr. Smith will be forced to breathe pure nitrogen gas through the mask. It's a procedure that's never been tried before, never been used in the United States for an execution. And a lot of people are worried it's going to go terribly wrong.
Yeah, I understand there are concerns the gas could leak out, yeah?
Yeah, his lawyers are arguing that if the mask is not sealed on his face, then that could change it could become dislodged, and that will change the amount and the content of the gas. That could prolong his death and his suffering. And of course, Mr. Smith is very likely to pray audibly. He chose to do that last time when Alabama tried to execute him the first time in 2022. When he prays audibly or when he's making his final statement, the mask may become dislodged. That would be one way that the execution could go wrong. And then his lawyers have also argued that because Mr. Smith is suffering from so much trauma from that first execution attempt, that he's been nauseous and has been vomiting almost daily. And experts have said if he vomits in the mask, he could aspirate that material, and that could also prolong his death and increase his suffering.
27 states in this country have the death penalty on the books, though just a handful currently employ it. Alabama is not the only state looking for alternatives to lethal injection. Help us understand why. What are the broader challenge? Is it gaining access to the drugs, or is it the actual logistics of the event?
A few years ago, pharmaceutical companies learned that their drugs were being used in executions, and they objected to that fact. And that led them to withdraw those drugs from the market or refuse to sell them to prisons. And that led the prisons to sort of try to find alternatives to the lethal injection. They first tried to create their own set of drugs or use untested combinations of other drugs, and that resulted in some terribly botched executions like we saw Alabama do in the summer of 2022. So now they've identified alternate methods. Some are proposing to return to the electric chair, to hangings, even to the firing squad.
Now, in recent years, I believe the number of executions in this country has gone down. Is it expected to continue trending down?
Well, I would expect that it would continue to trend down for lots of reasons. We'll never go back to the time 20 years ago when we had 300 new death sentences a year and almost 100 executions. We've learned so much more about the vulnerabilities of people who are in our criminal justice system, including the effects of severe mental impairments. Our lawyers are doing a better job telling their life stories. The laws have changed, and I think society, for many reasons, has some serious doubts about how effective, how accurate, and what kind of a sound policy the death penalty actually is. There's a recent public opinion poll that says more people actually believe the death penalty cannot be administered fairly by their government than believe it can be administered fairly. So a majority of Americans have real challenges, real doubts about the way that the death penalty is being used in the United States.
More broadly, as far as support for or against the death penalty in this country, what do the numbers, the polls tell us?
Well, the public opinion polls sort of as a straight up or down question. There's just roughly 53% of people who still believe the death penalty is appropriate for murder. But that number has been declining in recent years, and the number of people who oppose the death penalty has been increasing. So I would expect those numbers to also continue to change. And, Mr. Smith's execution is not only causing a lot of concern, but the public is sort of reacting in a very sort of horrified way at the idea that we could try twice to execute an individual and then use this very risky, untested execution method. That, I think, is only going to create more questions about how it's being used here in the United States.
We've been talking to Robin Marr, Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center. Robin, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Watch great videos produced by your public media stations online. Find Buffalo Toronto Public Media on YouTube and check out interviews by our WNED Classical hosts, original productions from WNED PBS, and so much more.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
This is What's Next. We're speaking with Megan Byrne, a staff attorney at the Capital Punishment Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Thanks very much for joining, Megan.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to begin, it might be great to have you describe a little of what you do at the ACLU. You work for the Capital Punishment Program. What does that work look like?
Yeah, sure. So at the Capital Punishment Project, we really want to, essentially defend against the death penalty in a wholesale way. So, the ultimate goal would be the, abolition of the death penalty as a means of punishment. But, that's done through various means, including representation of, particular clients who have been sentenced to the death penalty or have been threatened with the death penalty. And there's a lot of litigation, particularly in state courts, where different states have passed things like racial justice acts, where we represent a particular client, but also uplift the, conversation generally around discrimination and the death penalty. And for my particular position, I very much concentrate on racial discrimination and death penalty.
And so what has that work led you to discover about, racial inequity as it relates to the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I worked, generally in the criminal legal system before this, but what I really discovered in terms of capital punishment is that a lot of the, disproportion we see in other aspects of the criminal system are very much heightened when it comes to capital punishment. So even if you're just looking at things like the numbers, generally there's about 40% of people sentenced to capital punishment are Black people, versus again a 13%, population rate in America. So that's just a very big discrepancy. And to see those kinds of numbers, I think, can be kind of surprising when you first start in this work.
Speaking here for our audience in Buffalo and Western New York, earlier this month we learned that the Justice Department is seeking the death penalty for Payton Gendron in the federal case for the racist mass shooting he carried out at the Tops here in May of 2022. So the state case is done. In his case, he was already sentenced to life in prison without parole. But just kind of based on your experience and when it comes to federal death penalty cases, so can you just talk a little bit about, this is going to require a whole new trial, right, for him as a defendant?
Yeah, so the question will be, will he, if they're seeking the death penalty, the question is, will he be, ultimately given the death penalty?
And that will be decided by a jury, but there's really two decisions that have to happen in these cases, right? There's the bifurcation of the trial. Can you explain a little bit about that?
That's right. Yeah. So it's a typical death penalty trial. There's the bifurcation, which refers to the fact that you have the first stage, which is a guilt phase. And so when we think of trials, often that's what we're thinking about, a jury that decides whether or not you committed the act beyond a reasonable doubt. And then the difference with the death penalty trial often is that the second stage comes in, and that's often referred to as the penalty phase. And at that level, a jury is often deciding whether or not they would recommend or they would sentence you to the death penalty based on the guilt that had been established in the first phase.
And in your experience, given your familiarity with capital cases, what does a death penalty case look like? I mean, I know there's no typical one, but how can they play out in the courtroom? And I know, how long can they be expected to last, really, is I think what has been a question on a lot of people's minds in the community, knowing that, there is the trial, there's the appeals process, all that stuff can take a very long time. What's your sense of how long something like this could actually take?
I think it's, as you kind of alluded to, it is kind of hard to say in terms of the trial itself, so often the penalty phase of a trial, as opposed to the guilt phase. So it's not relitigating, was this act committed, but it's more about, and now at this point, if we've decided as a jury that the act was committed, should the death penalty be awarded? A lot of times that will be more discussion about things like mitigating factors, in the person's life, the person who committed the crime, and different things like that, while the government will often be talking about things that they call aggravating factors, things that they think make it so the death penalty is more warranted. And so that's that's a process that, how long it takes really just kind of depends on the amount of mitigation or aggravation there is to discuss. But you alluded to the appeals process, and that's really where the time really comes in, where you have people who are executed for crimes that they were convicted of decades before, after a lengthy appeals process. And as you might imagine, an appeals process takes a very long time to go through from the beginning to the last appeal.
So can you talk a little bit more about this idea of mitigating factors versus aggregating factors? Because essentially the aggravating factors are what may end up, that's essentially what the prosecution is trying to, I guess, not prove, but that's what they're focusing on, right? While the mitigating factors are what the defense tries to sort of focus on, right? That's maybe a bit of oversimplification, but is that kind of the idea, that there are these two factors?
Right. Yeah. Those are kind of the factors, are the two like larger buckets that are being weighed. And always taking into account that a juror might weigh both of those factors and decide all of this mitigation, all of these aggravating factors, and then decide that based on what they've heard, they feel that the death penalty is or isn't warranted. And so often that's kind of that often will include a deeper dive into the person's life. It might be there's so many different things that could be at play, which is why there's kind of no exhaustive list of things that could be mitigation, but that could come into someone's educational background, someone's mental health background, someone's neurological situation as far as health goes, their background in terms of like their childhood and growing up, and how they were treated. There's really just so many things that go into it. And so the idea is to really kind of flesh out the background of a person more beyond that this act was committed. The question is, what else is there about their life that a jury could consider in determining not to, sentence them to the death penalty.
And so, speaking about your own work for a moment, you've been a public defender. You've focused, as you mentioned, on racial inequality in the criminal justice system. You also you have focused on non-litigation strategies for addressing racial bias in the criminal legal system. I'm really curious what that looks like. What are some of those strategies that you've focused on and that you've worked with?
Yeah, so my work is really concentrated on accepting this idea that racial inequity is very much it's very prevalent generally, but certainly in the criminal legal system, and not wanting to limit what we think the solution might that be to one particular case and the outcome of a case and one particular judge. And so while I think litigation is extremely important, I really wanted to focus on things like let's look at the laws that there are, right? Some laws that are written really have disproportionate effects against people of color. So are there ways to discuss those laws? Are there ways to even propose the writing of new laws? And so, I've done some work around, legislation and speaking with people. I've spoken with people, at the New York state level to see what, what thoughts are about laws that could be passed, laws could be amended, things like that. And I think a big part of it also is public education, which is something we very much also value at the ACLU, which is really just letting the public be aware of what some of these issues are, and raising awareness around things that, there's certainly things that frankly I didn't know until I delved into this, and I have wholeheartedly believed that if the public knew more about these types of things, if there's more public education, that there'd be more movement on some of these issues. So I think those are two big non-litigation strategies. There's also community organizing, and going directly to community. There are really just so many ways that we can look at these issues, and someone doesn't have to be a lawyer to, make a difference in these different areas.
You mentioned learning a lot of things that were really surprising to you, and especially you as a person who has spent a lot of time working in this field. Can you share maybe something that you learned that surprised you, that made you think of this work, or maybe think about how policy and education can make a huge difference that maybe you hadn't considered before?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of things. One, I think, is that this is just something that particularly I've learned so much more about the more that I've done this work in terms of capital defense and race, which is about the linking of the death penalty to lynching. And I say that because I'd heard as a public defender, people refer to capital punishment as legal lynching, things like this, and I understood that there was very much a disproportion in terms of who received capital punishment. But the more that I had done this job, I've done more and more research into that link. And one thing that frankly surprised me was doing research and finding out just how direct the linkage was between this period of time in America where so many lynchings were prevalent, and then the public, reacted poorly to this and was essentially, making it clear that they were not fine with lynchings, that this wasn't okay, and that we saw certain people decide, well, let's go the capital punishment route in reaction to that, and this idea that, well, that would be more palatable to people. And so there really was a time period where you see lynchings, the amount of lynchings lower and the number of capital punishment rise at the same time, and kind of take off into what it is today. And I thought that was surprising, just because it just seems so marked, and I guess so much more transparent than I had thought that it would be before I really delved into it.
Race is such a crucial component to this case that we have here in Buffalo with Payton Gendron, because obviously it's a white defendant who carried out a racially motivated attack, now facing a possible death penalty sentence, while the data shows that the application of the death penalty has, kind of as your work has touched on, has been mired in racial prejudice, with defendants of color largely being executed way more often than white defendants. So I'm just curious, what your take on that is as it kind of relates to this case. I mean, it seems like that's a very complex, a very dense background and history to apply to something that's happening and, quite frankly, affecting a community was victimized, is traumatized because of this, and is frankly still healing and going through that process. So I'm just curious if in your work and in your experience, if you you have a take on that, if you're able to maybe shed some light on this for folks in the community who are trying to work through and untangle that themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like you said, it is so complex. To be honest with you, my heart could not go more out to the community of Buffalo and to the community that was targeted. I felt it very viscerally when this happened, and so I think it's holding in it's holding at the same time complex emotions, right? Because I very much feel that. I feel it very viscerally, and at the same time, I feel very strongly that any kind of nudge forward on the road to the acceptance of capital punishment as something that should exist, or something that isn't racist, or something that won't end up disproportionately killing so many more Black people. I At the same time, I can't support anything on that road. And so I think that it's a little scary for me, because I have heard people say, well, in this case, we're talking about a white defendant, and talk about more of the details of the case. And I understand those points that they're making when they say that, and I guess have to always, when I have those discussions, reaffirm that this is this is a policy that is going to continue supporting this form of punishment that's just been so very racist and so mired in racism, and there's no reason to think that if we don't continue supporting it, whether it's in this case or in other cases, that it's not going to continue to have the disproportionate effect that it not only has had, but was actually designed to have from its outset. And so I very much I think I commiserate people who are trying to balance those complexities. And at the same time, I do think that it's really important to note that at one point, it was said, I believe in the campaign trail, that President Biden would not support the death penalty, and that support, I believe, was support that would further racial justice and racial equity. This decision to further the death penalty by any means, I don't think is a reason that would support racial equity or further racial justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is obviously, as you mentioned too, there's a lot of emotion tied up in this. That's part of why I bring up that appeals process, because the longer this particular case goes on, and the news headlines continue, and occasionally there's a lull, and then more news headlines happen. That becomes a point of trauma. It becomes an emotional, a longer emotional process for folks. So I'm just curious, in your work, have you seen that process and kind of the length of it and all of that take an emotional toll on folks? I mean, on families, on defend. I mean, in the people that you've been around in your work.
Yeah, no, I think it's very emotional, and it's with any kind of hard loss or anything like that, any emotional thing that we go through in life, you often hear this idea of closure. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, the idea that these are such long processes. And we do know this person was given, life without parole, and that was a sentence that happened. But in terms of kind of starting up a new process that will then again go on for a very long time, I think it kind of goes to that idea of closure. And you see that the process of emotions doesn't happen quite the same when something is not over. So I do understand that, and I do think that putting aside the racial equity that I've kind of been hounding on about the death penalty, there are a lot of, I think, more, you could look at them as more kind of logistical reasons that I don't believe in it. But one of them is that this idea of the time that's involved, and not just the fact that it leads to something that's more expensive than even life in prison is, for the community, like, I don't know, as far as financially goes, but that it's something that is also, arguably more expensive emotionally, in terms of the time that it takes, and the many, many years that would pass between, the time of a sentence and an execution. I think that those are just kind of battle around.
So the defendant in this case here in Buffalo is due back in court on Friday. And I'm just kind of curious, like, from your point of view, broadly speaking, maybe what's next for for this case in terms of what people in the community should maybe be prepared to just kind of endure, or as like I said, as these headlines come out, is it just a matter of trying to understand that it is going to be a long process and try to do whatever has to be done to get through?
Yeah, I do think that it is important to realize just how kind of long and drawn out a process like this is. And I think that, so I don't think that anyone should go into this hoping for something very, very quick, just because that's just not likely to be the case. And I think it is important for people's mental and emotional well-being that they really be steeled as to the reality of what that's likely to be in terms of, all the time taken. And it also makes me think, what about as different things happen, as far as, whatever happens in the case, whatever happens in appeals, if there, if that's what it comes to, there's kind of this resurgence often of the subject, right? And so it might not even just be that it's long, but it might be, a revisiting of trauma. And that's something I really would want people to be able to be prepared for as well.
Well, Megan Byrne, thank you so much for being here on What's Next. Megan Byrne is a staff attorney at the ACLU Capital Punishment Program. And we really appreciate the conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Hey, is this thing on?
Test, 1, 2.
Sounds great. Let's go.
The podcast world is overflowing with more than 750,000 podcasts to choose from.
But for great local podcasts, you can now go to one place, the new Amplify BTPM Pods app. Here you can discover content produced in Western New York and Southern Ontario, our own backyard.
With a wide variety of genres to choose from, there is something for everyone.
Listen to the best independently produced podcasts in the region, anywhere, anytime.
Download the free Amplify BTPM Pods app wherever you get your apps and begin exploring your local podcast community now. Did you know that WNED PBS is always working on great new local shows for you to watch? Documentaries like Kleinhand's Gift to Buffalo, which tells the story of Buffalo's music hall.
The hall is very intimate, and that intimacy makes everyone who comes in here feel a part of our family.
Fun and educational series like Compact Science.
Believe it or not, peppers are technically fruits.
And Shakespeare's greatest hits, featuring some of his best-known soliloquies and monologues.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
You can watch them all on our website at wned.org/local shows. While you're there, check out the show pages and mini websites for additional content such as bonus features, photo galleries, and lesson plans. Find it all at wned.org/local shows.
This is the Buffalo-Toronto Public Media History Bite, bringing you a peek into significant historical events for the week of January 29th through February 4th. I'm your host and program director, Tom Barrich. Western New York, historically not usually known for its seismic activity, did register an earthquake on January 29th, 1864. The rest of these are all February 1st. February 1st, 1878 is the date that the first phone company began operations and registered its first call in Buffalo. Though originally founded in 1960, the Buffalo Bills did not join the NFL until February 1st, 1970. While the Pan Am Exposition happened in Buffalo between May and November of 1901, tickets to the historical event went on sale to the public for the very first time on February 1st, 1901. And February 1st, 1948 is the date that musician James Ambrose Johnson Jr. was born. That musician will later go by the more recognizable name of Rick James. You've been listening to the WBFO History Bite. Discover more stories about Western New York's past on the Buffalo History Museum's website. Learn more at buffalohistory.org. For Buffalo-Toronto Public Media, I'm Tom Barrich.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
This is What's Next. Today we're speaking with William Easton, partner at Easton Thompson Kasperek Shiffrin, who has been learned counsel for death penalty cases in Western New York and elsewhere in the state. Thanks very much for joining us today.
No, it's my pleasure.
So before we talk a little bit about this case, I would love if you could just kind of give a little background when it comes to your involvement in death penalty cases. You served as counsel in capital cases, worked in the Capital Defender Office, and I'm just kind of curious, like what that experience was like and what that entailed.
Yes, I worked at Capital Defender's Office for probably 11 years. And then as part of it, I administered the office, tried 3 or 4 cases, and worked on capital teams for probably another 6 or 7.
And so at the Capital Defender Office, like what was your actual work? I mean, you were essentially you were defending folks who were up against death penalty cases, and that was at the state level?
At the state level, yes. In New York, had a state death penalty for about 12 years.
And
then I was eliminated. The feds kept the death penalty, and then after the death penalty was eliminated stateside, I worked in the federal system for probably another 15 years.
Okay, and so what's an example of like the kind of case that you would work on in that office? I mean, I know I'm sure there's no like typical capital case, but in terms of like what that entailed, I mean, a lot of that work on the defender's side comes into this idea of mitigating factors, right? I mean, that's a lot of what the defense in capital cases focuses on. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes. A capital case differs from a regular case in so many ways, but the fundamental difference is that there's 2 trials. There's a first trial, it's to guilt or innocence, and then if it's guilt for a capital offense, then there's a second trial as to sentencing, whether the mitigating factors are outweighed by the aggravating factors.
In this case that we've been talking about earlier this year, we learned that the Department of Justice is seeking the death penalty for Payton Gendron in his federal case for the racist shooting attack at Tops here in Buffalo in May 2022. So he's already been sentenced to life in prison without parole on the state charges, but these are obviously federal charges. Is it typical for the Department of Justice to seek the death penalty for someone who's already been sentenced on state charges like this? Is this something we've seen before?
Certainly not typical. I can't say it's never been done before. There are pending cases in that area. We had a case in the Northern District where the client had pled guilty, was doing multiple life sentences, and the feds still authorized a death penalty case.
And so can you give a little bit of background of New York State's relationship with the death penalty? You sort of mentioned this before, but obviously it hasn't been in place here at the state level for, I think, almost 20 years or so, right? But can you give a little bit of the history?
Yeah, New York reinstituted the death penalty in 1994 when George Pataki was elected governor. Then for about, 11 years, it proceeded until finally it was declared unconstitutional on state constitutional grounds. And so it was disabled, pretty much dismantled, and it's never been revised since. So I think it was 2004 or 2005 where it's officially the state court of appeals ruled that it was unconstitutional.
What was the context around the state court of appeals making that ruling? I mean, that was brought about in reaction to a particular case, or that was the result of a lot of litigation? Or can you explain a little bit about how it ended in the state at the state level?
Yeah, kind of a esoteric issue, but it was it involved a jury deadlocking on the sentence, whether it would be life without parole, death, and what would be the consequences of it. And the New York statute was that if it was deadlocked, the defendant was entitled to a life sentence with parole. But then the jury was informed of that. And then our argument was that was unconstitutional under the state constitution because it allowed one juror to determine the outcome and expose the defendant to parole relief by holding out.
So in terms of your role, like at the Capital Defender Office, it's interesting because you, in defending against capital or in being defense in capital cases, when the office closed, I mean, what was your reaction? Was it you're kind of out of a job, but was it in a certain way? It's kind of what you had been working toward, if that's like one way to look at it.
Yes, I was ecstatic that the law was disabled. It deserved to be. But it was a little bittersweet because I had to disassemble the office and lay off 15 people.
And so you said after that, then you started working at federal cases, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what about here in Western New York in terms of the relationship with capital cases and kind of the region here? I mean, it seems, given that it has been 20 years since the state got rid of the death penalty at the state level, to have a federal case here in Western New York seems like a pretty, a unique event. So can you talk a little bit about like your experience? I know you did these cases throughout the state, but is there a particular like a case or something about the relationship between Buffalo or Western New York and what having a case like this Gendron case now, what that means or what that kind of signifies for the area?
Well, the Western District of New York hasn't authorized the case really before Gendron for 20 years or nearly 20 years. It was Noah Gladding was authorized around that time. Yeah, I represented Gladding. And what happened was the Department of Justice eventually withdrew the death penalty.
So as learned counsel for a defendant possibly facing the death penalty as a sentence, like what can you talk a little bit about like the likely steps of a capital trial? I mean, there's and in this case, let's take the Gendron case for example. There's the DOJ's notice to seek the death penalty, and then there's all the way to when he may get sentenced. What are kind of the steps in between that we can sort of expect to see play out?
Well, there's a number of steps. Yeah, a lot of them are going to be time intensive. The steps will be motion practice. And the motions are very complicated about venue, about what mitigating factors, what sentencing factors will be involved. Are there psychological, not defensive, but mitigation factors?
And then from there, I mean, we can expect appeals, right? Because typically in these cases, all the way up until until after the sentencing, there's appeal. Is that a decision that he'll make with his defense team, or is that something that happens automatically? Can you talk a little bit about that?
An appeal is automatic.
Okay, and so what exactly would that mean? So the trial ends, you get sentenced, and then that process starts up automatically. What does that mean exactly? That essentially just a lot of waiting until the case is taken up again in the Court of Appeals?
Yes, the direct appeal would go to the Second Circuit. and it would be the examination of the entire trial, the beginning to the end, and any legal issues that came up with it. And then the Second Circuit will make a decision. If they find in favor of the government, the defense can take it up to the Supreme Court.
So there's no guarantee of how long that process might take, because there's no guarantee of what the process actually will look like until it plays out, right?
No, and that's only the beginning of the process, because if the Supreme Court sustains the conviction, then the defendant can bring what's called a writ of habeas corpus and litigate that. And he litigates that at the district court level, and if the defendant doesn't prevail there, he can take that up to the Second Circuit and then up to the Supreme Court.
So there are a number of avenues that a defendant can take to basically appeal this, and it's not just one appeal.
Right.
Okay.
And it's not over. I want to stress it's not overly technical. There are many defendants that were released after the habeas corpus. The errors discovered. And if you streamline this process, it will inevitably result in someone being convicted and sentenced to death without adequate legal reasons and proof.
So, given your background, that is exactly. I mean, what kind of drew you? I would imagine that it's that exact kind of mentality that drew you into work in the Capitol Defender Office. What were some of the what kind of led you there? I mean, there seems to be this idea when it comes to capital defense, particularly, that it's about an attorney or a team of attorneys wanting to make sure that every mechanism is in place for a defendant to get the best representation that they can, essentially, because of constitutionality and at the highest level that might be a capital case. Is that kind of what led you in? Is the desire to want to do that and be part of that?
Yes, that's part of it. I mean, the essence of it is it's human beings on trial for his or her life. They deserve a defense that's equivalent to that, and so that you're on trial for your life, you're entitled to the defense of your life.
And what exactly? How do you approach that? I mean, that seems like such a large task. So how do you kind of approach that? I mean, I'm sure it's different for every case, but do you have to go into that with that mentality, or is it easier to think of it, I don't know, in some other way, or I don't know, just the magnitude of that I think strikes me, and I think would strike folks who I certainly don't have legal background or have, if they do, they maybe have never been in a situation where they've had to defend against a capital offense. What do you think about in the lead up into that and during the trials?
Well, the magnitude, as you put it, Patrick, is overwhelming. And that's why you need a team, and that's why you explore everything. Because, holding a human being's life in your hand is that you have a responsibility to defend it with every bit of energy and persuasiveness and passion and legal arguments that you can summon up.
And this is something that I hear, and I sort of apologize for almost even saying it, but it's something that I've heard said, there's this idea of how can you defend someone who's accused and charged with these crimes. I mean, maybe people have said that to you, maybe not, but I'm sure you've been around that kind of conversation. What's your thought process if you hear a question like that, or maybe you even have a response to it? But I just assume that that's always something that, if not spoken, it often is unspoken, I think, in someone's mind, or it can be in terms of maybe what is a very heinous offense.
Yes, that lingers around, but truthfully, it lingers more for the guilt phase I don't think many people belabor the fact that a defendant should have the opportunity to defend whether he or she is executed.
So can you talk a little bit about like the end of your time at the Capitol Defender Office? So you said you were ecstatic, but obviously there's the hard part of then having to close the office and people are out of work. But what's that must be an interesting combination of feelings. What kind of was the energy like in the office as as you sort of packed it up and realized like this was the end of the road for that particular office?
Oh, it's sad to lay people off, and they're all talented, and it was sad, but it was outweighed by the benefit of getting rid of a death penalty that was costly, destructive to many things in our community, and was ultimately so much more beneficial to not have it.
And so that's an interesting point, the cost of it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, because that might be a point that, and this is something I've seen before, but there is sort of an analysis, right, of how much it actually costs to keep someone on death row, and then also eventually executed, versus what it takes to just have them in prison for life. And there's numbers that can back up the fact that the death penalty is an immense cost. Is that right?
Yes, there's been a number of studies that differ a little bit. I think Duke University did one a decade or two ago that was the gold standard, but it's pretty much acknowledged that they actually sentence someone to death and go through that appellate process that we talked about earlier is tremendously expensive in terms of the defense costs, the prosecution costs, expert costs. So there's no question of tremendous amount of resources that an execution requires. That's just financial too.
Sure. Okay. So, in what are some of the other costs then?
Human cost. People dealing with executing someone, the court staff, the actual people that injected the defendant, the spiritual advisors, the cost to the families involved, both the victims and the defendants.
And I think the other portion that you had just alluded to before that was in terms of, I think, inequality, or maybe that's something that I've heard a lot about, the way that the death penalty ends up being meted out. And is that something that you ran into across your cases? Is that something that you've talked about or heard about, just in terms of, I think specifically racial equity, it comes up in racial inequality, it comes up in that space too. Is that something that you have a lot of, that you came across in your work?
Yes, a lot of studies on that. There's a lot of factors involved in control for, but one of the major determinants is location, where the crime occurs, and racial components. And it's basically skewed.
With that in mind, as this particular trial does continue, the community that was targeted in the attack essentially re-experiences it through news headlines. This is a community that's still trying to heal. Often folks get thrust back into it through news headlines and updates. I'm curious, have you seen anything in past cases in your experience that might speak to this? Are there lessons to maybe be gleaned about what to keep in mind as this particular case and cases like it, as they do often take a long time to from, as I said, from the Department of Justice making their announcement to eventual appeals and that whole process? What's there to be kept in mind throughout that whole process?
Well, I wouldn't presume to speak on behalf of any victim. Every victim's family has unique circumstances and considerations, so it's all different. But I think it can be fairly stated that that long process, the agonizing reliving of the offense, does create substantial pain for a number of victims. And whether that's a pain that they want, a pain that they think it's worth it, that's an individual decision. But I don't think there can be any question that the actual execution will bring about so much reliving and of the event, of the horrendous event.
Are there larger implications about what having the death penalty on the table in this case might mean for future cases in Western New York? And I guess I should say I'm asking this while also knowing the history you just laid out about, we're talking about a state that it's gotten rid of it at the state level, and this is a federal case. But are there any implications the way as you see it for the region in terms of what this case could mean for the future?
I think it's too early to make those conclusions, but that's a political decision too. The decision to seek the death penalty is the Attorney General's decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's her decision alone, and that's no matter how assiduously or honestly the Attorney General seeks to divorce him or herself from politics, they never can.
Yeah, for sure.
In this case, who knows what would happen here? There's a change in administration or a change in the Attorney General. There's all sorts of factors that could come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the name of our show is What's Next. I mean, what would you recommend sort of people in terms of what's next for this particular case? What would you recommend people kind of watch out for, or just kind of keep their eyes open for in terms of what might come next in terms of court appearances, in terms of I don't know, when the case actually starts to get going? What would you recommend people keep their eyes peeled for?
Keep your eyes open for the motion. There's going to be a number of legal motions on this case. It's exceedingly young. He's got a prior conviction, multiple life sentences that he's dealing with, and there are some legal issues raised. So I think the public should be prepared for an extensive period of time for have these motions aired out and litigated fully. And then there'll be a trial date set if the case isn't resolved before then.
Is there a long-term kind of emotional impact on just how long that process can take, including the motion, including all the other factors, and then through the appeals? Is there, and I kind of asked that openly, meaning from the counsel, from any number of people on either side of the case here. Is there, in cases like this, as we kind of talked about earlier, there is high emotion. Is there an emotional toll, a cost of these cases? I mean, the longer they go on, are those emotions prolonged for a long amount of time?
Duration would certainly add to it, but it's unquestionable that these cases are emotionally exhausting. And as an attorney, you have to devote your whole practice, your whole energy and effort to this one task to save your client's life. And as that drags on, it becomes very, very draining.
And when you were doing these cases, how did you kind of weigh that and weather that emotional cost? Were there any, sorry to get a little personal, but I'm just curious, as someone who's really, this is your career, this is your specialty. What kind of lessons did you learn in terms of being able to handle all that?
Well, you draw upon your professional allies, and I think even more importantly, your personal cadre of supporters, people that you love, your family, and they help you through it.
William Easton is a partner at Easton Thompson Kasperek Shiffrin and a former attorney at the Capitol Defender Office here in New York State. Thanks so much for joining us here on What's Next.
No, it's my pleasure.
And this is What's Next on WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station.